Yeah. It is a huge problem. Their needs and their risks are not very well understood. And I'm going to talk about that in a number of cases today. And if you like, if you're ready, I can just jump right in with my presentation. I'd be very happy to get started.
Yes, please.
Okay, so
Yes, you can start. Everything's okay.
I need to share my screen. So if I have permission, here we go. And we're going to have this up, and I just get to the, let me see. So, whoops, it's not my first slide. So let's go back. Get the quick tour here. Here we are. Okay. Sorry about that. Good, excellent. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about autism, ADHD, and the intersection with legal problems. And I'll be presenting a number of case histories from my personal experience. Here we are. This is the full title, and I've copied from the original announcement sent to me. I hope that it's the words came over correctly, so let's jump right in here. As my gracious hosts were just saying, there is a rise in interest, and as you can see here, we have an increase in the number of publications about the intersection of ADHD and autism. So we see here that there is a slow rise and increase down there of articles that are talking about how these things interface. And for very good reason, I would add, because as you'll see, the problems are more complex than the parts. So there's a unique risk profile, as a lovely recent article has shown, and I will be emphasizing throughout. These children and young adults are more impulsive and more impatient than you might even expect with ADHD, as we can see here. This is a very recent article from Dr. Joshi. Dr. Gagan Joshi is a researcher and a clinical psychiatrist here in Boston who has done wonderful work over the last decade on the interaction between ADHD, autism, and the comorbidity of different psychiatric conditions with autism. And what I've emphasized here over in the right-hand corner, this is the combination, the ADHD and autism. You see how much higher we see the impulsivity, the impatience, even compared to the ADHD, the so-called norm, the very high level of symptoms of that. So this is a subpopulation that has its own profile, very, very interesting. So there's very little research that has been done on the comorbidity, and here's something. This is from England, the National Institute of Health Research in the United Kingdom. They looked at what's going on and a longitudinal study of the treatments, and to some extent identifying the needs of individuals with autism and combined with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, looking at them across the lifespan. And they did, as we all do, a very thorough research into the different databases down here: PubMed, Embase, PsycInfo, Medline. And guess what? When we get to the chapter on this is on adults here, on autism spectrum adults with ADHD in prison, they found 4 articles. Back when they did this, I guess it would have been, the research would have probably been about 4 or 5 years ago. They found 4 articles. And this is what they found. They found a very high rate of depressive episodes in these individuals, a high rate, not surprising, of antisocial personality disorder in these individuals because they are all incarcerated. And I find this suspect, this low rate of PTSD. I'm wondering if they were asking the right questions, as I will be discussing and emphasizing later in my talk today. PTSD is probably higher than they are saying there. So I am skeptical of that particular finding. But again, very little cumulative research on that. So this is from that report and some of the references that they found. An unmet need, a clinical competence in correctional facilities. They found it wasn't just the corrections officers, but also the health and mental health care staff taking care of these individuals. A third of them did not know what autism was, and half of them didn't know what we used to call at the time of this research, Asperger's, we would now call high functioning autism. And a third of them also didn't know that these individuals are vulnerable, have psychological needs somewhat different from the general population, and their senses could be affected. And sort of the harsh prison environment might be particularly overwhelming for these individuals. They didn't know that. In a separate study cited in this report, a lot of people working in these correctional facilities believed that they had prisoners who had unidentified autism, and that prisons were not an appropriate environment for these individuals, and that these facilities were not meeting these people's needs. So we have the unmet need of there's the lack of clinical competence within correctional facilities, leading to a large range of problems. As you saw back in the earlier slide, I'll just take you back in a second. This probably is related to the unmet needs, this very, very profound high rate of depression here. And I'm wondering if what they're calling depression might also have a PTSD component, but we don't know that. So the unmet needs here, clinical competence and sensitivity. So let's take a little further dive into how these conditions create unique psychological profiles, and this take us into some other related research. So how do these create further needs that might not be met? So this is a very interesting study by Le Cavalier and a wide range of people at a number of facilities, including some of my mentors out at UCLA. I was very happy to see Jim McCracken's name on here. And they found that there's an extraordinary rate of additional comorbid diagnoses in these individuals. So 2/3 of individuals who have autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have additional diagnoses, an extraordinary level. So every time I look at this slide, it's shocking to me. And it has caused me to really open up my thinking and to really conceptualize these children and young adults as having very complex, very, very deep psychological needs, which then often will lead directly to additional forensic issues and needs. So I highly recommend this article by Le Cavalier. And here's some quotes from it. This is the title of the article, An Exploration of Concomitant Psychiatric Disorders in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. And what it caused me to do is I thought, how can I emphasize this with you? Is it attention deficit disorder or attention deficit plus autism is really autism times ADHD. So it's synergistic. It's not just additive. These conditions really multiply the risks. So from the Le Cavalier article, if you have two diagnoses, other psychiatric conditions that are comorbid, and Dr. Joshi has done wonderful work on this in multiple articles in the past, over the past decade, those rates are doubled. They have very high levels of other disorders, much higher than the autism population in general. And 50% of these children are rated as having oppositionality in addition to their other diagnoses. So one of the things I'm proposing here is that these children with these multiple comorbid diagnoses have an intrinsic higher risk for developing legal problems given their deficits and their vulnerabilities. So I'm going to talk briefly now about the concept of diagnostic overshadowing, originally developed by one of my teachers, Dr. Robert Sovner, quite some time ago. The concept of diagnostic overshadowing is that if you have one diagnosis, for example, autism, it casts a shadow, and then the clinicians don't see the other diagnoses hidden in the shadow, and they don't look for it. So people would say, well, he's just having those symptoms because he's autistic, or that he's intellectually disabled, and so he couldn't possibly have another diagnosis such as depression or PTSD, could he? And so that is the concept of diagnostic overshadowing as a basis for bias in clinical interventions, and also leading to medical error, as I will emphasize and illustrate a few times in my talk today. So the thing to remember is, if we don't see the disorder, we cannot treat the disorder. So understanding and remembering this idea of multiple comorbid diagnoses, very, very important. And take for this example, we have these children on the autism spectrum. They have hyperactivity. They're engaging in self-injury. They're showing this vigilance. They have sleep disturbance. Sleep disturbance is anywhere between 50 up to 85% of children with on the autism spectrum are found to have sleep disturbance. We think it's inherent in autism, but wait a second here. Is it just that? We look at these children, they're anxious, they're vigilant, as I said, they have sleep disturbance. They seem to have what's called rapid mood swings, but it's not really mood. It's just all of a sudden they become anxious, they become fearful, they're hyper aroused, they're non-compliant. They want to get out of certain situations. They become aggressive to escape. Is it possible that we're missing a comorbid post-traumatic stress disorder in the autism ADHD component? Is it possible that this diagnosis could be layered on in addition? And I tell you, I think it is. So there's an emerging recognition, and the studies are starting to come out. PTSD is more common in the autism spectrum disorder than had previously been discussed. In Dr. Joshi's original paper on comorbidity in 2010, one of the possible diagnoses, PTSD, is not even listed. But we have learned a great deal in the past decade. Look at this, a prevalence rate. Compared to the general population, maltreatment, there aren't a lot of studies that really give us demographic graphics. That's why I chose this one. It's over 20 years old. But look at the prevalence rate of maltreatment in non-disabled children in general, and the rate in disabled children. So this is what Susan Segroy once called the vulnerable population problem. So much, much higher, more than 3 times the rate of maltreatment. So here we have a study from adults, and look at this extraordinary difference as measured, PTSD measured in the adult group just last year. These folks are doing some very interesting research, but very, very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is why I was suspect of the earlier report. If this is a adult group comparable with autism, and the rate of PTSD is so high in this population, I'm skeptical of the low rate in the prison population. So extraordinary high rate, 8 times the level of 8 times. So again, I said it's multiplicative. It's not just additive. And from that study, you look at some of the differences as they break it down, the much higher rate of hyperarousal here, as I said, and negative attributions, please, got a little ahead of myself, and difficulties in social events. This could be because they understand their limitations, or because these have been environments that have been traumatic to them. So something to consider. A very nice study that takes a look at and it starts unpacking the post-traumatic stress disorder component within this. So our understanding is advancing as a way of just sort of torturing myself to get ready for this presentation. I put back into PubMed a combination of autism plus ADHD plus PTSD, and picked up a large number of studies. Rumble and colleagues, as you can see, have been putting out additional information in 2020 and 2021. And so these are the names of a bunch of additional studies in English that I submit for your further study and education in this area. So we have the unmet need here, the overshadowing of other diagnoses in the combination of autism spectrum and ADHD, and a source of bias and error in diagnosis. And I've cited here a more recent reevaluation of diagnostic overshadowing from the 21st century, a very nice little article that takes a look at this concept and brings it up to date, something to consider here. So moving along, I'm going to now jump over and into some case histories. Every one of these case histories is a case that I have touched personally to some extent and have worked with or been involved with in a forensic level with all these individuals. So our first case history, I call it, every one I sort of give a name and I've changed some of the identifying details. So I call this ADHD goes to college. This is somebody who I'm currently treating. This is a child who's known to have ADHD. He goes into college and he gets in trouble. This is the first thing that happens. I also should say, this is a young man who is movie star handsome, very handsome. I tell people he looks like sort of like Tom Cruise, but, you know, a bit more attractive than Tom Cruise. And girls or young women are throughout his high school and college career have been going up to him and trying to get him to be interested in them. And he would have relationships and they would have a sexual relationship. And usually by the end of the evening, sometimes, you know, 2 or 3 evenings, they realize that he doesn't really have it. He's very handsome, but he doesn't really have the right stuff. He can't connect with them and they're done. They move on. They get it. He is very eager to make friends. And as he explains to me, he is like a little puppy dog, you know, and he is, as I talked earlier about the interaction with ADHD and autism, he is impulsive and he is impatient to make friends. He's an average student in high school. And he is, as a freshman, he is put into a dormitory and he has roommates. His roommate is much more successful with the girls and his roommate has a girlfriend. The roommate and the girlfriend go off into the roommate's room to do what college students do. Leaves the girlfriend's phone is left in the common room. He looks at the girlfriend's phone. He sees that she has nude pictures of herself on her phone. And he takes her phone and he sends the pictures to himself. Then his roommate and his girlfriend are busy in their room with the door closed. He takes his cell phone, he puts on it a recording, and he slides it under the door and records the sound of the roommate and girlfriend making love. A tremendous violation of their privacy. It's also a crime in the state of Massachusetts to audio or videotape anybody without their permission. And so he is facing criminal charges, felony charges. But because he doesn't have a criminal record, he comes from a nice middle-class family, he is given pretrial probation. With the possibility that after this probationary period, the charges can be sealed. So he is told he must leave this college, and there's no choice. And he has a probation officer. I'm treating him. I write nice letters about the therapy, and he goes to college number 2. But in the summer before college number 2, I say, listen, guys, we're going to do it right this time. You know, there's some things, you went off to school, you weren't really ready for all those challenges. And let's go over first what happened? What went wrong? Why did you end up doing these things? So let's develop some introspection. He says weekly therapy with me. I tried to get him to understand his feelings and his impulses. He keeps talking about what he did as if it happened to him and he was an unconscious participant. So I want him to become conscious of his feelings, his impulses, and to understand that what he did hurt other people. So we get the student handbook. We talk about the rule of law in the United States, Title IX. We talk about sexual harassment and issues and how that's handled in the college. And I said, I want you to read the student handbook, which I got down online. And I said to the parents, these are the rules that you have to play by. And I said, you know, you should probably have a single dorm room. Shouldn't be living with other people right now, less risk. I'll write you a letter, but you need to get the college, you know, this is the summer before you're going to start at college number 2, you need to let them know you need a single room, and you should probably call the student health services and say, hi, my name is so-and-so. I have problems making friends and meeting people, and I have this therapy. I might need some help. They did nothing. Parents, and he did nothing. School is about to start. He doesn't have a place to live. He's never gotten identified with the student health services. So his parents, who are very well off financially, rent him a nice studio apartment, walking distance from the school in downtown Boston. There are many schools in downtown Boston, so we won't say which one. He goes to school. He joins the group of commuter students in the commuter lounge, and you know, he's a very attractive young man. He invites girls back to his little studio apartment to study with him. And by the end of the first semester, he is facing charges of sexual harassment complaints from 3 different co-eds, from 3 different women at the school. There is a hearing, and he is given a 2-year suspension from the school. The suspension starts, and shortly thereafter, as everybody knows, the pandemic starts. And so everybody's career is sort of suspended, and so he sort of disappears in there. He is very lucky that the district attorney, you know, everything got a little crazy, didn't learn about his probation violations, clearly, what happened. So during the pandemic, in the course of the past 14 months, his probation has ended, mercifully. So he has nothing to do with college number 1. He is still suspended from college number 2. And we have continued in weekly therapy. So he also has a job. He's been taking online courses. So, you know, he has a lot of uphill climb to do. So he's working at this fast food restaurant. This is his job, part-time. And they've come in the morning, they're setting up the restaurant. They have music on in the background. There are no customers. There's a 17-year-old, so she is a minor, a cashier. And he puts on certain music because he gets in early. He's a very hard worker. He likes to make food, so he's very focused, very rigid on what he does. He starts one type of music. She wants a different type of music. So he gets upset because she changed the music. He changes it back. She changes it back again. You know, they're both being children. He grabs the remote control for the music from her hand, and he yells at her, and he insults her. He calls her the C word, as we say in English. His manager talks to him. He hasn't been fired yet. This is in the real time. He's had, you know, close to 2 years of therapy now. He's got a little bit of insight, a little bit of insight, but he's still impatient. He's still impulsive. He's very self-absorbed. He has very, very limited social intelligence or awareness. And, you know, in the course of working with him, I've had to explain what are the components of a heartfelt and sincere apology multiple times. And I say to him, you know, I would say to him, Bob, which is not his name, we talked about this, a few months ago. If you're going to make an apology, what are the components that you have to remember to have in there? And he can never remember the one that is most connected to theory of mind, that acknowledging the other person's feelings is an essential part of making a heartfelt apology, that acknowledge that he has hurt somebody else. This poor girl was very hurt. He's tried to play the clown. So his approach to things like that is he'll just be silly and be a clown, and that'll get over it. And I said, no, you really need to acknowledge, you need to take into your own mind that she has been hurt. And these women have been hurt, and you need to acknowledge that. And then you have to explain how it's not going to happen again. So we've gone over this many, many times. He also has a social skills specialist counselor. So he has weekly therapy with me. I manage his ADHD medication. Occasionally, I negotiate some of the interventions and things around his relationship with his parents and his sister. And he has someone who specifically works with him on social skills scripts. Yet we still had to continue to do this. So unmet needs, social skills training, supervision, and even though he's technically an adult, he still needs structure and people watching him because he's very immature, as well as treatment for his ADHD. So next case, this is a large and very complex case. This is a child who's very small for stated age. I treated him for a number of years, and then I no longer was treating him. So there's a lot of clinical detail here, and he was not directly sent into the legal system. He was sent to a residential treatment facility that specializes in kids with inappropriate sexual behaviors, children and adolescents and young adults with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities. But and that was a diversion from the criminal justice system. So he had, what's interesting and also often intersects with the diagnosis we're discussing today, he had prenatal drug and alcohol exposure. He came from a horrific family background with neglect, chaos, and violence. He was taken away at 18 months from his parents after multiple attempts. He went into multiple foster homes. His diagnoses were ADHD and autism and language disorders. And that's all they came up with at the time. Very impulsive, lack of empathy, danger to other kids, almost suffocated a baby, has run out into streets, almost caused serious bodily harm to himself. He was cruel. He had a lot of self-injury. He once walked up to a teacher, just stabbed a teacher with a pencil. He was in multiple hospitals. He sexually assaulted a number of children. Became very dysregulated in the hospital, defecating and urinating on the floor, exposing feces. As you probably can imagine, at this point, I would presuppose that he had post-traumatic stress disorder himself from his severe adverse childhood experiences, and neglect, and probably sexual abuse himself. And he was probably dissociating at this time. Later, when he came to the program where I worked, I would observe him in the timeout room, and his voice would drop like about an octave, and he would start yelling and castigating and insulting himself and using adult profanity. And it was clear to me that this was a dissociative episode that happened time after time. And he was in there and he was yelling at himself as if an adult was yelling at him. So sexually offending behavior starting at age 7, and at 9, grooming younger children. So he's at my program, one of the youngest people at the program ever at age 11. He had a lot of neuropsychological deficits, difficulties with language processing, a lot of cognitive limitations that were consistent with a fetal alcohol exposure profile. So And then he was very frustrating for the clinicians to work with. So I supervised master's level clinicians, and they just complained that I have to, he just repeats things back to me, and I have to keep explaining things to him, and he doesn't get it. I have to tell him things again and again, and he doesn't seem to have a coherent way of talking about things. It's a very, very fragmented, and it involves lots of frightening images. And I said, this is a child with serious language problems. And so his whole way of hearing you, his whole way of expressing himself is very disruptive. And she hadn't had a lot of training or experience in that. So she wasn't very clear about what was going on. And they talked about him getting into power struggles. So I'm giving all these details because I would imagine that many of you have had experiences with children and adolescents very similar to this young man, and that you have seen staff become frustrated and angry as these staff here that, he's not making any progress. And, if all you have is a hammer, everything is going to look like a nail. And so the therapist said, oh, let's get him an occupational therapy evaluation. Or, gee, Dr. Sharrock, do you think he has OCD? And I said, let's talk about language impairment. Let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's like, well, those are common diagnoses. Yes, but that's what's going on here. He's rigid, he's perseverative. You would see that in ADHD, you'd see that in autism. He wouldn't do his schoolwork unless his name was written perfectly. Well, he didn't understand the schoolwork, and this is the way he could do something that he understood. He wasn't responding to prompts. His language processing was slower. If he was reprimanded, he escalated quickly. He could be triggered by how people were talking to him. He could, again, experience shame that once again, he's doing things wrong. And when you're this child and you're doing things wrong, you might imagine you're going to get beaten pretty soon. He gets what they call escorted to the timeout room. You put hands on him, you trigger his PTSD. And understand that what's going on, where he then is yelling in this loud, deep voice for an hour at a time, that he is in a dissociative state. We need to help him calm down and be grounded and to feel safe. So we talk about he has problems with transitions. He needs constant redirection. Let's put that in his behavior plan. Let's do what I call, and other people have called, cognition checks. When you say something to him, what does he understand? So you ask him, okay, what did I just tell you? Let's use repetition, pre-teaching as well. Tomorrow we're going to do such and such. These are the 3 parts of such and such. You get people ready. And let's do more transitions. You say, Ron, we're going to, in 5 minutes, you're going to stop playing with computers and we're going to go back and work on our spelling. That's the next academic period. Give them time to transition because he needs longer to transition. So his behavior is improved once the staff became more trauma sensitive. He was on tons of medication. I took him off topiramate, clonidine, amantadine. He was on a huge dose of Abilify. He came down to the tiniest dose. I added the dexedrine for dextroamphetamine for ADHD. Tiny bit, good results, more focus, more on task. His most severe behaviors, they went down. He never developed pro-social strategies, empathy, or made friends. So the deficits remain very profound. He remained a risk to himself. Would he ever be able to live in society? I leave that as an open question. I don't know. After I completed this case study, I thought, there's more. There's an epilogue. After he was no longer my patient, this is what happened. I heard from reports that he was getting frequent nosebleeds. The staff was blaming him. He said, "You're picking your nose." He said, "I don't do that. That's not me. It's disgusting. Everybody has their limits." I swore I wouldn't, but he kept repeatedly getting what apparently were spontaneous nosebleeds. Eventually, this went on for close to a month. They take him to a hospital emergency room. White blood count over 10,000. Platelets under 10, almost non-existent. He had leukemia. Finally, he got to the care of a physician was treated and he survived. But this is a near fatal case, again, of the diagnostic overshadowing. The assumption does that it's all in the diagnoses that we already know, and we don't have to think about additional diagnosis. This is a case where diagnostic overshadowing almost killed the child. So unmet needs here, clinical sophistication from the therapists, patience. These are difficult children to treat. Progress is slow. Not non-existent, but slow. There are comorbid conditions, appropriate psychopharm. These children typically get put on what I call the flavor assortment package. So kids like this who are treated by people who don't get to interface with the rest of the clinical staff. People are frustrated. There's lack of sophistication. They will have one antipsychotic medication, one mood stabilizing medication. So like a SSRI, like Prozac, one ADHD medication, one additional anti-epileptic medication that might be a mood stabilizing medication like Depakote, or maybe have nothing to offer in psychiatry, like Keppra or gabapentin or oxcarbazepine. But so, and then to round it out, you may have clonidine or something else. But they'll be on 5 medications, and they will be a mess behaviorally, and they may be falling asleep during the day. And for example, if they're on topiramate, which can cause individuals to have word finding difficulties, and they already have a speech and language impairment, they can really suffer and have difficulties in communicating. So there's a great deal that is needed here, but with a level of sensitivity to the nuances of the problem and sophistication, progress can be made. And often it involves a lot of deprescribing of medication and enhancement of other services. So I'm going to move over to the issue of competence to stand trial. I'm hoping we can go over a bit in time because we got started a little late. I still have a lot to talk to you about. And so the first general legal concept is the competence to stand trial. And I'm going to use the definitions of my home country, the United States, and with the understanding that this is envisioned somewhat differently in different legal systems, but we need to use this as the example. And so the competent to stand trial, I'm going to talk about a patient I call Miss My Little Pony. And she is a girl. She likes these, I call her My Little Pony because as I was talking to her, she was anxious and she was rocking a lot. And she had one of these My Little Pony dolls in her hand and a comb, and she was combing the tail of the My Little Pony the whole time I talked with her. She was so anxious. I interviewed her, and her mother was in the room with me. She said she's never been without an adult, never had been in a situation where there wasn't an adult watching her. So she lives in an isolated part of the state of Massachusetts. She was homeschooled. She had what was called a play therapist. I have no idea what that therapist was doing. I never saw the notes. Her primary care doctor, her pediatrician, gave her fluoxetine, Prozac for anxiety. So people understood a bit already. When I interviewed her, she supposedly had one friend. I said, well, when's the last time you did something with your friend? I said, I don't remember, maybe it was 3 months ago. So did you go to your friend's last birthday party? I said, I went to her birthday party 3 years ago. I haven't been to a birthday party since. She's been very busy. So justification. Her parents are what the records called idiosyncratic. They were very odd people. They had a business that was sort of barely making enough money for them to survive. They would come up with T-shirts that were sort of funny, but sort of weird and nerdy. And they would silkscreen them in the barn behind the house, and they would sell them online, and they make a little bit of money. So this child who I saw in a forensic examination, and you'll learn why in a minute, was obsessed with horses. She's volunteering at the local stable down the road. You know, her mom drives her over like 2-3 times a week. She supervises with someone. She feeds the horses. She helps, you know, groom the horses. She loves horses. Has very little to do with people there. The people who run the stables are very kind. They let her come in, and the home is filled with things that look like this, you know, very immature, very childlike. A horse is filled with that. So this is what happened. Very little contact, socialization. She's with her parents or with her maternal grandmother. That's it. And when the parents need a break, they give her to grandma. So she's coming home one day after spending the day with grandma. Grandma set some limits about something. I think it was about, you know, how much dessert she could have. So they're on the front lawn in the house, and she becomes impatient and impulsive and angry. This 15-year-old girl pushes her grandma. She's little, the grandma's little. Grandma falls to the ground. At the same time she hits the ground, she has a heart attack. The district attorney finds out about this. She's charged as an adult with assault and battery with lethal attempt. The district attorney is not going to back down. So I show up in court as an expert and try to explain what's going on with this girl, you know? So it's horrible. So I interviewed her at the family's kitchen table in this cute little house way out in the country. Whenever I ask her a question, she doesn't reply. She looks over at her mother and sort of, she waits for her mother to answer. And her mother does answer. It's almost like ventriloquism, you know, like the child is a puppet. And I explained to the mother that I'm here to interview your daughter. It's already enough that you're in the room. You have to sit over there. You can't answer my questions. You're here so your daughter can be calm, but I'm conducting a forensic interview. So Ms. My Little Pony, she continues to look. So she'll answer a question, and then she looks at the mom, is like, did I answer it okay? So I used the assessment tool, which I've provided you, the juvenile adjudicative competence assessment tool. And I asked her, so let's go through the different things here. There are different people in the courtroom, Miss My Little Pony. Tell me, what is it that a judge does? And this is a quote that I wrote down in my notes. This is her total explanation of what does a judge do. As you can see, it's very sort of reflexive on itself. It lacks content. And she's not even sure about what she's saying. And it's and it's wrong. You have to tell the judge everything. Well, that's precisely one of the things that is not what you have to do. You know, in a court of law, you cooperate with your attorney, and you answer the questions that are asked. You're under oath, but you don't have to tell them everything. You have to answer the questions truthfully. This is not about confessing. So I included this particular answer as a sample because it demonstrates a lack of competence here, because it demonstrates a lack of understanding of a very basic and simple part of competence to stand trial, adjudicative competence. She doesn't even understand the differences, what the role of a judge is. So I give my testimony, and I ask, will the judge consider these diagnoses as mitigating factors, that she is less than fully responsible, here. But the first thing is, I try to explain that I don't think she is competent to stand trial. So I don't think she's competent. I also, if she were to be tried, is she criminally responsible, or is only a partial responsibility? But the first thing is, I don't think this child belongs in the courtroom. They disagreed with me, and they did have a trial, and of course it was continued without a finding, and she was on probation. Nothing else ever happened, but they insisted on the trial. They wouldn't, the district attorney wouldn't let that go, even though I thought clearly she does not meet the standards, the basic standards, the very simple ones of, do you understand what the judge does, what the prosecuting attorney does, what your attorney does, the difference? She couldn't do that, but there's more. So she's very vulnerable. As clearly her impatience is part of what got the problem started. What an unmet need here is a legal system who understands what her limits are. Her parents could have had some psychoeducation. She could have benefited from socialization. And in working with individuals who have this type of language problem, they need to be required to speak. You have to build that muscle up. So they have to do more speaking. They need opportunities to do that. So I have some additional slides here on the competencies to stand trial. This is the original case on the standards of adjudicative competence. And so it was the Dusky case, and this is what was considered the standard at the Supreme Court level. And it's the basic components are what show up in different jurisdictions, more or less, as the components. You have to be able to consult with your lawyer, and you have to have what's called a rational as well as a factual understanding of the proceedings. So there was another case, which was an adult who was psychotic, just an example, and he insisted that the judge was a puppet, and the judge was not actually speaking, but the devil was pulling the strings. And so when the judge's mouth moved, it was the devil. And since it was the devil, he didn't need to listen to the devil because he was a religious person and the devil was wrong. So he was not going to listen to anything the judge said. So I explained that this person was not competent to stand trial. Even that person was an adult. Interestingly enough, the state's prosecuting attorney claimed that the person was rational because they were not schizophrenic. So I had to explain in court that the person was delusional. It wasn't schizophrenic, was not having hallucinations, but was having delusions. And there were other ways that people could be irrational besides schizophrenia. Schizophrenia was not the sum totality. So that's what happened as an aside in that case. So different standards, different jurisdictions have different standards, but those are the essential components. So it's easy to separate out the extremes. So people who are grossly impaired, at least I thought on the second case that I described to you, an adult, clearly were not competent to stand trial. And I thought that this girl, this child was also, but mild deficits, it's not so clear. In the criminal courts, in the adult court, some of the things that could happen is the lack of ability to assist in defense, and specifically the ability to weigh alternatives to make a plea agreement. And an example of where this can go wrong is, say, Johnny, would you rather serve 3 months or detention, or would you have to be on probation for 2 whole years? That's a long time. So, and I've heard of cases where that's done. I said, I don't want to be on probation for 2 years. Oh, I'll take 3 months incarceration. There is no clear legal precedent for being incompetent to stand trial due to a developmental incapacity. So the nuances and subtleties, the law doesn't like that. The law likes black and white. So in the juvenile court, the threshold is even less clear because less is expected of an individual when they are in juvenile court. But whether or not they can actually proceed there, it's not really clear. They're supposed to have somewhat different objectives, more rehabilitative than purely punitive, but that's not always the case. And this is Dr. Thomas Grisso, who's written a number of books, and this is this book called The Forensic Evaluation of Juveniles, the first book of its kind, really, and then now in the second edition in 2013. So it's hard to get it quite right, is what Grisso was saying here, to meet the expectations and notations of fairness. You could either require or too much or too little ability to. So these are very difficult cases to deal with. And again, another book, Dr. Grisso's Forensic Evaluations, there may be a match or mismatch between the person's abilities. And remember, increased demands such as greater complexity, like in a criminal courtroom, it's noisy, people are coming in and going out. what's happening is changing all the time. Somebody's saying something, people are objecting, people are getting up and down on the witness stand. There's something going on constantly. The people with the combination of these deficits may have trouble staying up and on top of what's going on right now. The sheer number of witnesses, the length of the trial, they lose concentration. Having to testify themselves can be very traumatizing. They get fewer supports in the adult criminal court. Then there's less likely to take their personal circumstances into account in the criminal court, and the defense itself can be more complex. Plea bargaining itself is a particular problem and something to look at. Depending upon the jurisdiction, 90 to up to 98%, I saw, and I have this article here for you, of all criminal charges end in plea bargaining. So the ability to weigh these things out, to hear what is delivered to them verbally, and to use their executive function and figure out and make a decision for themselves. Are they competent to make that type of decision, decide their fate? I'll take that charge and deal with that. So I assert that individuals may not be competent to make that type of decision. So adjudicative competence. There are lots of areas in which individuals with these multiple deficits may fail to meet that. So I've broken down, using a different book by Dr. Grosso, again, called Double Jeopardy, about individuals with impairments and how they are at double jeopardy, increased risk. So they have to be able to understand, they have to be able to reason, and they have to be able to appreciate this information and weigh it and understand the salience or the power of certain facts and things. And they have to be able to transcend this immaturity that you see in individuals who are developmentally delayed, and grasp the meaning of time. It's sort of like that example that I gave about how you could put a spin on things and individuals would be just would be vulnerable to that. So this is the functional components of adjudicative competence. And language impairments can interfere with adjudicative competence, as I have shown, as can social intelligence, because you lack the ability to understand what's being implied in nonverbal communication or sarcasm or irony, or implied threat. So these things will be lost to individuals who are more concrete. What else can interfere with ability to be competent at the time of trial? If you have untreated mental illness, there's the psychosis that I described earlier, untreated mania. People would be grandiose, possibly, in what they thought they could do in the courtroom. They could be irritable, they could be impatient. So untreated comorbid mental illness could also impair adjudicative competency. That is possible to be restored, but also, and a much larger thing, as the case I described before, a lack of a sense of self-efficacy. So someone would say, do you understand? Yeah, I understand, because they don't want to deal with the shame of what they have experienced over the years, the lack of capacity, the lack of self-efficacy, the lack of being able to negotiate things in the normative world where language is going much too fast, much too sophisticated for them. So I've given you the JACI, the Juvenile Adjudicative Competence Interview, as a model of how things can be done. It's one of the few assessment tools for juveniles. There are multiple ones for adults, but I gave you this one. And you notice that within this, one of the reasons I gave it is it has what we call these competency or capacity checks, which is the same thing as finding out if people really have cognitively taken this in. So it's cognition check. What did you hear of what I said? So if the child doesn't understand what a judge does, you teach them what the judge does. You then go on and do additional questions. You come back and say, let's go back and go over this again. What does a judge do? So you write down what they say the first time, you write down what they say the second time. I have done assessments on individuals who have been to court multiple times and seen multiple evaluators. So it wasn't just me doing it twice. In one case, I saw a child who had a total of 8 different assessments. So whether or not they did it a second time in the assessment, 8 people have tried to teach them what it is a judge does, what a policeman does, what goes into plea bargaining. And I explained it's not just that they didn't get it when I did it, they didn't get it when the expert for the prosecution did it or the other times. So you want to make sure they're not giving you just a superficial answer, which is what they did when the prosecutor's expert did the evaluation. The prosecutor said, oh, it's fine. You know, the example like I gave for that girl, they said, well, that's really okay. And I said, no, it's not. It's very superficial and it's not a functional assessment. So this is, again, what's in the JACI, and it does cover plea bargains. And I said, this is the weakest link in the chain. This is where things fall apart for the most kids, because those who've seen judges on television or in the movies and they know a little bit, they can sort of fake that stuff. But if most of the cases end in plea bargaining and you have a child who's not competent to make a decision in plea bargain, then the question really is, are they adjudicatively competent? A lot of the focus is on everything that comes before that. And I'm saying this is a deficiency in how we are looking in this country here at competence to stand trial in juveniles, unless they are competent to make a plea bargain, which almost inevitably will happen, then they are not competent. They are not knowing what a judge does, knowing why they're in a trial, knowing what to do if somebody, gives false testimony. That isn't enough. If they can't plea bargain, they are not safe to go into the courtroom because they may be offered a plea bargain and they could be led down the garden path. Again, so this is an example of the questions, the scripts that's in there, which is what I like. It really sort of, it's a lovely form, and I hope that it is of use to you. I'm going to go briefly into not guilty by reason of insanity, a criminal responsibility. This in the United States comes out of Old English law, and it is said that someone from the 1840s, it was decided you are not capable, you are not guilty by reason of insanity if you don't know what you're doing or if you don't know it's wrong. So it's all about knowledge. I meant to add that if you look at the history of not guilty by reason of insanity, there are things going back in various writings for at least 3,000 years. And we have things going back in pre-modern times in various codes, in various legal codes, but this is considered the beginning of the modern concept. It's about knowledge. It's knowledge-based, and you don't have to have everything. Either you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know that it's wrong. But it's just about knowing. So in the United States, you go forward about 100 years, and it's changed from knowledge to, it flips it to what you do is a product of your mental disease or defect, and so it's more about the outcome, and that it's the mental disease is causing it. It's not about whether or not you know. This is still considered somewhat outdated, and it led to the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code, which has been adopted almost universally. Not every state has it, not every jurisdiction. And it sort of flips it to the person is considered not responsible. And it's very specific. It's at the time of the event, their conduct, you lack the capacity at the time of the conduct. It has to be a substantial lack of capacity. And it's either you can't appreciate it, so that's the knowledge component, or you can't conform yourself. You can't contain your impulses. There have been other additional changes over time. It became what's called an affirmative defense. So it's not the sort of thing that is automatically given to the defendant. The defendant has to put forth the idea. They have to put forth the argument that they were criminally insane at the time of the event. So it has to be offered up as an affirmative defense. And it could be either one. In some jurisdictions, and like in my state, it's a little bit different. You have to have both. You either have to, it's both the knowledge and the inability to do it. So this is a case that I was involved with tangentially. I was not part of the legal defense team, but I was brought in briefly at one point, but not officially. So I have nothing to hide or to disclose because I never became an official part of the team, but I was asked to discuss the case as a possibility. This is a tragic case in Massachusetts. This is a child who was diagnosed with Asperger's, high-functioning autism, and ADHD, possibly bipolar, a lot of anxiety, horrific family history of psychopathology. Several adult members of the family had committed suicide, a lot of severe clinical depression and bipolar in the family. He was considered a very creepy kid, from a very early age. He talked about murder. He was very interested in forensic sciences and blood splatters, making bombs. He had no friends, okay? He was in this Great Opportunities program, which works with these vulnerable kids, didn't have a lot of effect. He has a history of bringing knives to school. Now, slightly before the index incident, he starts sleeping less. He has rapid speech. Is he developing something, a new diagnosis? Possibly. He starts wearing a trench coat like the trench coat mafia in the Columbine shootings. He becomes obsessed with this 4,000-page multi-book series called The Dark Tower, which is about a gunslinger, and the number 19. We note that he's born on November 1st, so it's like in 1990. What happens on January 19th, well, went ahead of myself a little bit there. What comes out later is he's been thinking about suicide and homicide, very, very dark, since third grade. In third grade, he had 3 wishes. Look how sad this is. He wanted to have money. He wanted to have all the junk food he could. And he wanted, in third grade, he said, treat me like a person, not a pitiful mistake. In 4th grade, he only has 1 wish. He doesn't want to be teased anymore. When he was teased, he stabbed a boy in the chest with a pencil. This is a warning sign, when he was bullied by female classmates, he talked about getting a golden gun. This is a child's fantasy, and he's going to shoot them. So he goes, he's at school, the Lincoln Sudbury High School. He excuses himself one day to go to the bathroom. He doesn't go to the bathroom near his classroom. He checks out several other different bathrooms. He goes to one at another side of the school, and he stands outside. He waits until another boy enters, a boy that he doesn't know. He has a large kitchen knife in his hand. He stabs the boy multiple times in the neck and in the chest on January 19th. He tells the teacher right afterwards, I just exploded. It was a mistake. He tells the police, he's confident. He thinks the victim's going to be okay. He then tells people at the crime scene afterwards where they can find the blood, including under his fingernails. When informed the boy had died, he was quite mortally wounded. He died before getting to the hospital. He starts weeping, but then he says, he stops and with a blank expression, he says, so what do you get for manslaughter? 10, 15 years? He's sent to juvenile detention where his phone calls are recorded. He talks to a friend where he says he doesn't think he could be possibly charged with murder because he did not know the victim. He tells his clinician, the therapist that he's assigned there, that this is my first arrest. I heard I was on cable network news, very grossly inappropriate. This is what his defending attorney says, so why does this geeky, uncoordinated kid who'd never been in troubles suddenly stab somebody who he didn't know? What came out at trial was that he had this morbid preoccupation, had been thinking about homicide for a very long time. So the expert and the attorney said that he was suffering from this illness that made him lose touch with reality. This was the defense they constructed. And the attorney said he wasn't capable of premeditated murder. He claimed not guilty because it lacked criminal responsibility. The psychiatric expert, not somebody I know, said that the killing happened during a brief 20-second delusional episode. He was psychotic for 20 seconds, and that's when he did it. He did it in this 20-second window when he was psychotic, and then he wasn't psychotic anymore. The jury did not buy this. They rejected this defense, and he was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There's vulnerabilities here. This is a child who was severely emotionally ill from very early on. He could have used more intensive mental health services. He could have used social skills training and positive experiences. Apparently the family, it was a very difficult, very depressing environment. And the schools should have had more anti-bullying initiatives. Clearly, this was very traumatizing. The role that it played is not really clear, but this is something to consider. We'll talk briefly now about another type of situation, which I've seen a lot of, what's called non-contact sexual offender, a non-contact pedophilic interest, rather. This is a fairly recent book. It has a introduction by an attorney that I've worked with a number of times on a number of cases on young men on the autism spectrum interested in child pornography. This book, Caught in the Web of the Criminal Justice System. The book was started because one of the young men who was caught in the web, his father was an attorney, and he is one of the editors of the book. And there's actually a chapter in there written by the young man who was in prison. He had no interest in having sex with children. He was fascinated with these pictures. So the non-contact sexual offender with pedophilic interests is actually a subset of risk factors within autism. So this is somebody who I did evaluate for the court. I call him Mr. No Contact. He's about average IQ. He's very isolated. He's high functioning autism. He has ADHD, which is treated. He's never touched a girl. When he was 16, a bunch of people in his high school found out there was going to be no parent home. They came over to his house, a bunch of boys, a bunch of girls, a lot of alcohol. They got drunk. They had sex in various combinations. They invited him to join. He's not interested. He went to his room, put on his headphones, and played video games until it was all over. He was mortified. He's completely sexually naive, never even kissed anybody. He's sent to community college. He's lost there. He goes, he comes home every day. He goes to school. He stops going. He doesn't even pay the tuition. He uses the tuition money to buy cannabis. He sits in his room and he smokes pot all day long, and he's not doing the homework. Every now and then he'll just get in the car and drive and say he's going to school. He's not. He starts seeking things on the computer. The computer algorithms, preference algorithms, start sending him things based on what he watches. So these algorithms know how to keep people interested. He starts with regular pornography and disgusting things. He likes watching opened chest surgeries. He likes watching videos of pimples being popped. And he gets into then bestiality and graphic child pornography. It's sort of like grosses him out. He knows it's not right, but he can't stop. He gets tracked on the internet. Interpol, the FBI, they find he is looking at these pictures. They tell him, we caught you, and he says, okay, I'll stop. So he's facing charges. His trial is yet to occur. He has an attorney. He thinks he's probably going to get some sort of probation or continuation because he's never had any charges before. What happens is he doesn't stop. He keeps doing it. One night at midnight, the FBI basically shows up, forces their way into the house. He's stoned out of his mind. He thinks he's in a cartoon. He has no idea what's going on. He's arrested. He is then sent to pretrial detention at that point, that night, and he is found guilty, and he is serving a multiple year sentence right now. I was in contact with the parents a little while ago. They asked if I might be available to work with him when he comes out. We'll see. He is impulsive. He's impatient. He's naive, he's curious, he needed more supervision, he needed more therapy. He was getting a little bit of therapy after the first offense, but they sort of dropped the ball on him. Substance abuse is an additional risk factor here. The parents were well-meaning, but they were naive. And he didn't really understand, as he described to me, that these are real children and that they are being victimized. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities and needs there. So from a much earlier study, institutionalized delinquents, that could be anything. Sorry about that again. Anywhere from over half to over 80% have some sort of language or communication deficit, which is severe. So a very early study, like 30 years ago, but it shows how pervasive language problems can be. I highly commend this article to you, the breakdown in the language zone. Lavinia and Van Rooijbeek talk about the dangers of having a language impairment, because people will judge them. They'll judge their character, the credibility, or their capacity for remorse. So, when a lawyer tells her client or his client, don't say yeah, you say yes to the judge, or don't interrupt the judge, because these kids are impulsive. Don't slouch, don't drop the F-bomb or wear a tank top. Addressing social pragmatics, which these children are lacking in. So language impairments can interfere with and impact forensic risk. The lack of comprehension, the lack of understanding, it can look that this is someone who has poor insight or poor judgment, but they're not really taking it in even. These people with language impairments may not be as amenable to certain types of treatment because it doesn't look like they're going to engage. As I described in some of the earlier episodes, earlier cases, these are individuals who need the environment to meet them more than halfway. They need accommodations. They can fake it, and they may pretend and hope that they understand and hope that they don't get caught. So they require cognition checks. You need to find out how little they really understood. So this is, a script that I would work. So I've explained something to you. Can you please now tell me in your own words what it is that I just explained to you? So now you tell me, as if you're explaining it to someone, and then I get to see what has processed through their brains. I don't want them to use my words and just repeat them. I want them to process it in their mind and give me their version, so I know they have some understanding. This is very different than what happens so often is the judge will lay something out and say, now, son, you understand what I'm telling you, don't you? And that's the person who has no understanding understands they're supposed to nod their head and say yes. That's what they understand. They understand they're supposed to say yes. They don't understand what's going on. Very, very different. So language impairments can lead to problems with decision-making and reasoning. We use language to problem solve. So their difficulties in functioning linguistically leads to their difficulties rather in making decisions and in thinking things through. So decision-making is a language function. If they struggle to use language, they struggle to make decisions. And these are individuals who also will show poor judgment because they're over-focused on immediate rewards. They don't want to think about things later. As a child I was working with earlier this week who just was returned home after being in residential care for a while, she says, and got into trouble. Actually, this is a teenager with Asperger's and ADHD, was hired by McDonald's, left in the middle of his shift to go have sex with his girlfriend and then come back to work in the middle of the shift. And they haven't fired him yet. Don't ask me why, because his parents are very strict and don't let him have sex, brings the girl into the house. That didn't stop him. And I wanted to talk to him about, this is not how the real world works. He's not facing legal charges yet, but he certainly makes bad decisions. So people who tend to have a simplistic and overly idealistic view of how the world works. So what can be seen in the courtroom is they look like they have a shallow affect. They look like they don't have empathy. But this is about processing. This is not about sociopathy. They're very focused on their needs and getting them met right away. And they have trouble showing remorse or emotion, even when they feel it. They don't think about consequences, and they may appear rude or disrespectful, but that's really a reflection of their general social incompetence. So again, to recapping some of the needs, we need to have a clinically competent staff in correctional facilities. We need to be able to think about overshadowing and possible diagnostic error, that we're missing diagnoses that are there or may be emerging. We need to think about unaccommodated language or communication deficits. We need to, these kids need help and assistance with accommodations, going slower and breaking things down using simple language. They can accomplish a lot more, but we need to do comprehension checks. What is it that you understand? Competencies are by definition state dependent. You have to be alert, you have to be present, you have to be able to focus and concentrate and think. So all those things. So as we've been describing, these core deficits can cause further legal and social complications and problems. You have to be very, very careful in the classroom. The inability to empathize and to apologize can greatly influence a judge or how a jury sees an individual. And a lack of ability to sustain attention may cause other people to think, oh, he's bored or he doesn't value what's going on. It can lead to frustration. It could lead to misjudgment from the first time an individual is apprehended by a policeman. It says like, oh, you're not taking me seriously. I'm going to arrest you. I'm going to bring you in, all the way to sentencing later. It's like, clearly you don't seem to understand the seriousness of this young man, so I'm going to give you a severe sentence. But it's not disinterest or lack of concern. It's a lack of ability to sit still. So as I was saying, juvenile justice needs to look further and consider that these disabilities are mitigating factors, that someone could be guilty but insane, that these things should be taken into consideration. In the United States, we have already reached a situation where we no longer execute individuals who are mentally retarded. So, because that's considered cruel and unusual. If they've committed crimes under the age of 18, we don't execute them either, as 2005. And more recently, even the imposition of life without parole for crimes committed under the age of 18. So the understanding that people have a chronologic immaturity, but it's not the same thing as a developmental immaturity. So there is room for further development there. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for going a little bit over in the time. I'm very, very glad to be with you today.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. We really recognize some of our patients during your talk, unfortunately. So if you don't mind, we also have some questions. So particularly you mentioned about the lower rate of PTSD according to the studies in patients with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD that were imprisoned. Mm-hmm. How do you think? Is it more a problem of methodology of identifying PTSD in patients, or it's more a problem that we need to consider about some specific criteria for PTSD in this population? You mentioned that patients with autism may be specifically vulnerable to some social events, for example. However, like according to DSM, as we know, like the I criterion is very clear, stating that without being exposed to situation when the patient's life in danger or he experiences very severe emotions, we cannot diagnose such kind of disorders. So maybe we should think about changing some methodology in applying specific PTSD criteria for patients with pervasive developmental disorders, something that was done similar for children below 6 years old. Thank you.
I agree with you very much. The application of standards for what is considered the index traumatic event, the A criteria in the DSM, is very much egocentric. It's based on criteria that would apply to, what we call the neurotypical population. And what you've highlighted is very, very important, is that these are individuals whose nervous system is much more raw, more vulnerable, more sensitive, and they are much more easily overwhelmed. I've worked with a number of individuals, for example, who suffer from hyperacusis, so sounds that we can barely tolerate, for example, like a fingernails on the blackboard. I have seen children break down and start weeping. That sound is so toxic and it's such an irritant to them that they just break down. So in the very early study, the United Kingdom study that I talked about, they mentioned that the people who work in the prisons don't understand that those loud sounds and bright lights and harsh conditions can be traumatizing. So I think the fact that we have set a criteria based on our nervous system, so if it's traumatizing to us, it has to be traumatizing to us in order for it to be traumatizing to them. I think that is a conceit which is inappropriate, that we need to think more about subjectively how is it being interpreted by the individual on the autism spectrum. If we know that their nervous system is different, that they are not neurotypical, then we can appreciate and accept that they can be traumatized by things that we can deal with. So I think that's a very subtle but important thing going forward. The DSM right now doesn't have, it says that trauma can't just be from looking at things on video. Well, for the past year, that's all people have been doing. But so the DSM is already a bit behind the times, and it says it has to be something in real life. And I certainly can talk about a number of children, and you folks probably also can, who have experienced trauma from things that they've just taken in, since they take in so much of the world now through the flat screen, through television, through the computers, through videos, so that we have to start thinking that this can possibly be traumatizing. I presented the information on the very first, one of the first slides from the UK study, because this is what we had there. But you notice they said a very, very high rate of depression and very low rate of PTSD. I worked for several years in a clinic, which was one of the more forward-looking things in the United States for adults. Individuals who had identified mental health needs in federal prisons were given 1 year of free weekly psychotherapy and monthly psychiatry. So I would see these people for 1 year, and a lot of them had undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as depression. Some of them had been suicidal the entire time they were in prison. They never talked to anyone. They were never given antidepressants. They held on. But I saw a tremendous amount of post-traumatic stress disorder. People would talk to me whenever they heard something, banging, like that's not, something banging, really like the clinking of a key on metal on metal. They would, because that was the sound like that the guard would make going down the line of the jail cells, banging on the side. So, or even a bunch of keys jangling, that would be enough to set them off. So I think, my clinical sense is that this is a study that was an error. Dr. Joshi, in 2010, his first study on comorbidity in autism, did not mention PTSD. And now he is doing research specifically on that condition in the autism spectrum as a comorbid condition. So I think there is a growing understanding and appreciation. Any other questions?
Чи є інші питання? So, if you don't mind, there is also a lot of people are watching us online. So if it won't be difficult for you, we would like to gather questions from them, and maybe it will be possible for you to answer like via email or something like this, okay?
Oh, I would be honored to collaborate and answer those questions. I've given you my email right here in the last slide. Sure. I would be happy to continue the discussion and the dialogue with my colleagues there. Yes, certainly.
Thank you very much. We also see this topic as very important and very interesting, and we hope for further cooperation with you and your further participation in our next events. Thank you very much.
I look forward to that, and I hope to be in person there with you at the next time. I would like that very much.
It will be wonderful.
Very good. So I'll say goodbye for now. Take care.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Шановні друзі. Є зв'язок, да?
Так.
Шановні друзі, шановні колеги, ми сьогодні напружено попрацювали в суботній день. І я хочу з задоволенням визнати, що і засвідчити, що програму нашого заходу 5-ї школи аутизму повністю виконана. Я дякую всім, хто долучився, зробив свій внесок в програму і проведення цього заходу. Я дякую учасників, які брали участь в офлайн режимі, за активну дискусію і обговорення. Всім дякую. І я думаю, що ми будемо вже з завтрашнього дня проробляти наші плани і працювати над програмою і концепцією 6-ї школи аутизму. До зустрічі через рік. Всім дякую. Всім дякую.
Асіно святкує 5 років в Україні. Швейцарія входить у 5-ку найбільших інвесторів в економіку України. Інвестиції швейцарської групи Асіно – це історія успіху та динамічного розвитку у фармацевтичній галузі. Вкорінені швейцарські традиції якості та майже 200-літній досвід є основою всіх виробничих і бізнес-процесів Асіно в Україні. Наша місія – це розробка та виробництво лікарських засобів швейцарської якості на благо пацієнтів. Власний науково-дослідний центр з розробки лікарських засобів випускає 2-3 нових продукти щороку. Ми забезпечуємо високу якість, ефективність та доступність нашої продукції, на яку можна покластись. Ми – це Асіно.
Синдром професійного вигорання або барнаут-синдром – це емоційне, психологічне, фізичне і моральне виснаження. Власне, й тому воно проявляється в тій ситуації, коли людина працює в надмірному хронічному стресі, з вимогами якого вона не змогла справитися. І це буде проявлятися тим, що вона надмірно втомлена, вона подавлена, вона проявляє депресивні розлади, вона проявляє тривогу. І основне, вона не хоче працювати. Втрачається суть самої роботи. Для чого я це роблю? І, власне, тоді вона починає опиратися тому, що її колись привело до цієї професії. Тому синдром професійного вигорання – це суто професійна річ. Людина в системі людина-людина. Займаючись уже більше 10 років барнаут-синдромом, ми розуміємо, що ця тема стала надактуальною взагалі на планеті Земля, в тому числі і в Україні. Власне, це і заставило нас з Антоніною взятися за наукову розробку розумінням, що таке барнаут-синдром. І ми створили цілий ряд відеолекцій, їх 25, для того, щоб достукатися і пояснити лікарям та й взагалі медичним працівникам, як він проявляється, чим він проявляється, до чого він може привести і основне, як запобігти барнаут-синдрому.
Проект з профілактики емоційного вигорання став для нас справжнім викликом, який ми прийняли з великою повагою. Створений нами посібник мав бути одночасно інформативним, практично корисним, стильним і комфортним у використанні. Ми поставили за мету створити унікальний інструмент для підтримки лікарів. І я надзвичайно рада, що це нам реально вдалося.
Сегодня у нас прошел здесь замечательный тренинг для врачей «Профилактика эмоционального выгорания». Я очень рад и доволен такому отклику, который получил от врачей. Видно, что эта тема им как никакая другая живая. Они задавали вопросы, они были очень вовлечены. И, конечно, с такой аудиторией работать приятно. Я благодарен компании «Асино» за то, что они организовывают такие замечательные события и заботятся про эмоциональное состояние врачей.